degree in art history and Japanese studies. She herself is an accomplished painter, and her novels combine her deep love of art, historical research, and travel. Alyson's novels have been published in over 25 languages and have reached bestseller lists both in the United States and abroad. She lives on Long Island with her husband and 2 children, and she is currently on board of her next novel. That's not enough. We also have Shawna J. Edwards. Shawna has a BA in literature from Harvard College and a JD from NY School of Law. A former corporate lawyer, she is now working in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is a native Louisianan. She was raised in New Orleans and is currently living in Harlem with her husband. The Thread Collectors is her first novel. Thank you both so much for being here today and sharing. Sorry, I've not yet read it. I highly recommend buy a copy. That's fine. Just to get us started. Oh, actually, let me tell you a little bit. Just to say that this story is about Stella, a young Black woman who's enslaved in New Orleans, and Lily, a Jewish woman from New York City, who risks everything for love, freedom, and during the Civil War. There's a really interesting story of 2 lives that would connect. And if you could just tell us how you guys started writing this book.
Absolutely. Did you want to? All right. Someone got to call us.
It's on.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. First of all, thank you very much to the JCC for having us. Your plates and the lunch was extra yummy, so that put us in an extra good mood. We're definitely going to tell you all about how we met, our inspiration behind the Thread Collectors, and how we collaborated. But before we dive in, first of all, I want to assure any of you that have not read the book yet, there will be no spoilers. And I would ask you that when we get to Q&A time, please phrase your questions so you don't ruin the enjoyment of the book for anyone who has not read it yet. And I'll give you a little bit more. Lisa gave you a snippet. But the Thread Collectors is really about 2 couples, one Black and one Jewish. Our Black couple, as Lisa mentioned, is comprised of Stella. She is in New Orleans and she is selling these covert maps out of repurposed cloth and thread to help enslaved men run to fight for freedom with the Union Army. And she's in love, but she's not able to be with him with William. He is a brilliant Black musician. William decides to flee to join the Union Army, and on the battlefield of Louisiana, he meets Jacob Klein. Jacob is a German Jewish soldier. He's also a brilliant musician, and he's been encouraged to join the Union Army by his wonderful wife, Lily Klein, who is a fiery abolitionist. I always smile because she's described to look a lot like Alyson. She's tall and has red hair. And it's really the friendship between these 2 men which opens up the novel. That's why we're always glad to see the gentlemen in our audience. But through their friendship, you discover how these 4 lives are intertwined and how people who are of different races and faiths and socioeconomic backgrounds really have much more in common than they thought. So that usually brings people to look at Alyson and I know you guys, like, how did you 2 meet? You don't seem necessarily like a pair.
Okay. So Sean and I have actually been friends for 13 years. I think it was our anniversary 2 weeks ago. And she said, we've been married for 13 years. And that's not personal after, but it sometimes seems like that because she's like a second extension of myself now, especially after writing this book. But we met in what I like to say is one of the most unlikeliest of places, at least unlikely for me. Shauna always has a twinkle in her eyes, is maybe not so unlikely for her. But 13 years ago, my husband came home. He's a corporate attorney in the way that Shauna used to be a practicing one. And he said he'd been invited to an all-expense paid vacation in Las Vegas. And he could bring a +1. And I had 2 children under the age of 3 at that time. And I couldn't get on the plane fast enough to be able to have a So the first night of the opening reception, I was standing online at the bar, and all of these corporate attorneys, 99% of them were men, were cutting in front of me to get a drink. And I was letting them because I was just so happy to be, out of the house in a pretty dress without like a fur cloth over my shoulder. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see this beautiful young woman come walking over, and she looks at me and she says, "Why are you letting every single man cut in front of you? And by the way, I like your dress," which I think is funny because there's so many, dresses in her book. But Shawna, I think you could tell I was not a.
She was not a lawyer. And so I asked her, I said, well, why are you here? What do you do? And she said she was a writer. And I'm sure that my eyes grew very wide because, as Lisa mentioned, I, majored in literature. And the idea that there is someone who can make their life out of creating characters and creating stories, and more importantly, get someone outside of their family to read them. I was like, wow. And so I basically demanded that she be my friend that weekend, and then demanded that she be my friend for life. And the great thing about being friends with an author is not only that you can convince her to come to your book club sometimes, but also that you can really have conversations about, well, what inspires you? What's your creative process? What are you reading right now? And for us, for Alyson and me, our friendship really was cemented over this love of books, and always sharing books, talking about her next project, and me just giving my perspective as an avid reader, which I'm sure all of you are.
Yeah, absolutely. We were even like sending each other books.
We would send each other books.
So Shawna became that person in my stable of friends who was the first person I always went to when I had a little seed of an idea for a book, because she was so interested in the creative process and also was such an avid book lover. I felt that if Shawna thought the idea was good, then I was on to something. So back in 2017, we met up for drinks in New York, and one of her first questions was, "What are you working on?" And I said, "I have a really rough idea for a Civil War novel in my head." Growing up, I was very, very close with my grandmother, and my grandmother would love to tell family stories to me. And one of the things that she often told me was that when on her side of the family, on her maternal side, they had immigrated from Germany in the 1830s, and that I had two great uncles who fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. And she would sort of say, we have a whole family branch down in Mississippi, but we, lost touch with them. And my mother, meaning my great grandmother, would say to me, "They're all Baptists now." And she would laugh. She thought it was funny, but I was always sort of fascinated by this idea. First of all, I didn't know that any Jewish soldiers fought in the Civil War. That was news to me. But also this idea of two brothers whose relationship was permanently fractured by the opposing views they took on the Civil War, that was never repaired, and that we had lost contact with this side of the family. So that was always in the back of my mind, that fraternal relationship might be interesting to mine for a possible historical novel. But then on top of that, I had just, before I saw Shawna for lunch, I had seen on PBS a documentary by Rick Burns, Ken Burns' equally talented younger brother, called Death in the Civil War. And the documentary highlighted two things that I was not previously aware of. One was that 180,000 Black men enlisted to fight in the Union Army at great risk to themselves, many of them fleeing enslavement to try and join up to fight for freedom. But instead of being given muskets to fight when they enlisted, they were given pickaxes and hoes and forced to do all sorts of demeaning and manual work, like digging latrines and trenches, and also burying the Civil War dead, which were, of course, the white soldiers. On top of that, the documentary highlighted that because there were so many dead soldiers during the Civil War, over 650,000 men perished on the battlefield. So just try to get your mind over that. They say in numbers, contemporary numbers, that would be like us losing 2.25 million boys, on our soil now. That the dead had to be buried quickly, and then the battalion would move on to the next, fight, the next battle. And so sometimes fellow soldiers would create maps on the back of envelopes or in their diaries or on scrap pieces of papers of where their fellow compatriots were buried, in the hope that after the war ended, these maps could be shared with the family members and the bodies could be brought back home up north, be buried properly by their family. So I said to Shawna, so I have this idea. What do you think of a Civil War novel about an unexpected friendship between a Black soldier and a Jewish soldier? Of course, I was planning to have the Jewish soldier have a brother down south, but the Union soldier was going to be inspired by my great uncle, who was a Union officer or Union soldier, and that somehow the Black soldier, again, I don't want to give away any plots, creates a map that somehow gets its way out the door to the Jewish soldier's wife. What do you think about that for a novel?
So, 2017, I was immediately intrigued, and as you might imagine, I was really focused on the character of this Black soldier and wanted more. First of all, the way we were discussing the soldier, and at that time it really was just a casual chat between friends, I'm thinking about what is the nature of this map. We had been discussing the soldier that he would have been formerly enslaved. He would have escaped enslavement. Well, while there were plenty of free Black men who fought in the Civil War, enslaved people weren't taught how to read and write. You know, they could face great consequences if they did. If a white person was caught teaching a Black person, an enslaved person, how to read or write, they could face consequences. So the map's not going to be a traditional map. It's not going to say turn left at the oak tree. So immediately I started thinking of something more visual, and I noted to Alyson, I said, well, what if the Black soldier gives whatever information he has, and once again, we're not giving away any spoilers, to his beloved, and she creates something out of cloth and thread and basically embroiders a map, makes something more visual. And I think like the best idea is you can't quite piece together exactly where they came from. I couldn't have told you at that time. I think we were drinking across from the Guggenheim. I was drinking. She was watching me drink across from the Guggenheim. I couldn't have told you where that idea came from, but now we've had the benefit of our collaboration and thought about it. And for me, it comes from my family history. So my mother was born on a cotton farm, a sharecropping cotton farm in Houston, Louisiana. Very tiny town, there's like 387 people there. And so for her and for her family, this idea of repurposing things, remnants, this was very much part of how she grew up. I am not a quilt maker, and I always say, ladies, please don't ask me to join your quilting circle. But my grandmother and my great-grandmother were quilt makers, and later on we have a few slides. And so this idea of people taking pieces and repurposing them and making something that's both utilitarian and beautiful is very much part of my family lineage. So I suggested this to Alyson. I was like, what about this idea?
And I thought it was a fantastic idea. In a few, brief sentences, Shawna had opened up the world in such an interesting way. Not only had she inspired me very much with this idea of a tactile map, one which you could instantly visualize, but also of another character of the Black soldier's beloved, so that there was a love story also. And so I remember leaving that meeting very inspired by what she said and seeing the story very visually and being excited to write it. But then something held me back. I can't tell you what made me go on to write another book. I actually ended up publishing in 2019 another novel called The Secret of Clouds. And I always had it in my mind, but the timing seemed off. And I like to say that when you're writing a novel, because it takes so much time, and typically a novel takes between 2 to 3 years for me to make or to write, and everything, like including the wind behind your back, has to be pointing you in the direction like this is the book you need to be writing now at this point in your life. I didn't feel that with the Civil War book. I felt like there were ideas and there were things I could see, but I didn't have that sense of the timing being the right time. And I think it's because I was waiting for that sort of the shared moment. And my missing partner. So fast forward to 2020, we were in the early throes of the pandemic, and the world felt very scary and very fragile. And then on top of that, we all witnessed the brutal murder of George Floyd and this reckoning of how much racial injustice and violence there is in our country. And I started to think about the parallels of the climate of what the United States felt like at that time with the Civil War. And I wanted to sort of go back into history and to sort of like learn from it. I felt like all of a sudden the timing of writing a Civil War novel seemed very prescient to me. But when I started to think back of that conversation I had with Shawna in 2017, I was very cognizant of the fact that my friend had listened to me and said, that sounds like a great idea, Alyson, you should write it. I would definitely want to read that novel. She had already contributed the building blocks of the story. She had already transformed it. And I felt like this really strong desire to sort of reach out and say to her, would you want to collaborate with me on this novel. I mean, that first time we met in Las Vegas, one of the first sentences she said to me is like, "Oh, I write a novel." Reading authors. I knew that, and I also knew that she, is brilliant and would be a wonderful, fun collaborator to write with. But I didn't know if she would be up to doing it, so I called her and I asked.
I thought she was crazy. And not. Yeah. You can see we're like tied to him, and not crazy because the idea that I might want to write a novel, because she is right, I've always wanted to write a novel, but crazy because for me, it felt like we were living through the most racially divisive time in our lifetime, in my lifetime, I should say. And I thought that we would have to revisit the most racially divisive time in our country's lifetime. And I didn't know if I had the emotional bandwidth to do it. My day-to-day work was spent in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes you hear that and you don't even know what it means. People are like, well, what is that? Well, really what it means is an organization is trying to figure out how it's going to respond to its internal employees, requests for more racial justice, gender equity, all of these different things that we need to correct about our nation. How is it going to happen on an organizational level? And then to spend your free time writing a book, as delightful as it may be, but dealing with, what is frankly a heavy subject matter, I was a little daunted. So I asked the people in my life, I think everybody has like a kitchen cabinet, the friends you go to when you have to really grapple with the harder questions. And it was probably my husband who gave me the best advice. That is not always the case, but in this moment, it was the best advice. And he said, I hear you speaking a lot about what the project will take from you, like what it will require. But I want to encourage you to think about what you might get from it. You talk about wanting to leave an impact, and this may be the way that you do it. And so I said cautiously, yes, to Alyson. And I never want to present myself as braver than I felt at the time, because I think to grapple with these issues of prejudice and bias and discrimination in our country's history, the world's history, it can be a little daunting. So sometimes it's okay to just take a small step. So I said yes to Alyson, and then
we were on the telephone. We both sort of agreed that we needed to see each other in person, to look at each other in the eyes and have a sense of what this project was going to mean for each of us, especially because, as I said, everything felt really fragile during that time period. And so I said, I think we should meet and talk about it in person, even though it was, during COVID. I said I would be willing to mask up and take the Long Island Railroad and meet her outside in New York. And Shawna looked at her schedule and she said, well, I have the first day off I have is Juneteenth. And I think it was the first of many signs along the way where we were like, maybe the spirits are sort of guiding us here. So we met in Bryant Park. For those of you who know Bryant Park, it's right behind the New York Public Library. That seemed also really auspicious. And we just started dreaming that afternoon that we were going to embark on this and do it together. And right from the beginning, we wanted to pull from both of our respective heritages, our histories, our faiths, to build something in this very scary time that we were going to be proud of and that was going to outlast us. And so I said to Shawna right away, I said, I really want to honor the ancestors that I know about from my grandmother. My brother had already started doing ancestral research. And so we knew the regiments that both brothers were in, that my uncle, who was from up north, he enlisted as a musician in the 31st Regiment of New York, where his brother had enlisted in the Confederacy in Mississippi. And so I said to Shawna, I really want the Union soldier to be a musician, because that, is from my history. And you right away.
I thought that was great, because then we could make the Black soldier a musician as well, as a point of commonality. And being that I'm from New Orleans, how wonderful for him to spend formative years in New Orleans, which I think is the most musical city in the United States. Sometimes people from like Nashville and Chicago will fight me, but I'll take that. And the other reason why I thought it would be interesting to feature New Orleans, not only because I know it so well and it would make the research a little bit easier, is because New Orleans has always been a place that had a unique perspective on race, even during the antebellum period. So now I'm going to be a little bit nerdy. In Louisiana, before the Louisiana Purchase, so before 1803, there was a set of laws called the Code Noir in Louisiana, and it actually prescribed people's rights And it actually recognizes different gradations of Blackness. Well, what do I mean by that? If you were fully Black, like we have a character Amine in our novel, you might have certain rights. If you were free Black and not enslaved, you would have other rights. If you were half Black, half white, like our main heroine Stella, they would use the term mulatto. That's not a term we use anymore. You might have a different set of rights, more than you would if you were fully Black. So there is this gradation of Blackness in Louisiana that I thought that it would be really interesting to explore. Most of my family, my people, they're from the borders of Louisiana and Texas. And this idea of how skin color has impacted their lives, basically colorism, is really central to, unfortunately, how I was raised, different people in my family, and I wanted to explore that. So that's why we have the character Stella, but we also have her sister Amine. And I thought that if we were in Louisiana, that would be a very good backdrop to bring something to the fore that we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also was so excited when Shawna mentioned that she wanted the Black soldier to be a musician as well, because right away we knew that the language of music was going to be something that cemented these two men who do come from such different backgrounds, and that the same way books did that for Shawna and I, that music was going to do that for William and Jacob. But another thing that you said right away that afternoon, I remember it so vividly, was that Shawna said, I imagine William coming from one of the Gullah Geechee Islands. And I had never heard of the Gullah Geechee Islands. For those of you who don't know about them or didn't know about them before the book, they are sea islands that are off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Shawna taught me this, I didn't know. I'm just sharing because I found it so interesting. And basically during the time of slavery, during the slave trade, Black people who were taken from parts of Africa where there was really, really rich traditions of indigo harvesting and dyeing and rice cultivation. And then they were brought to parts of America where those skills could be exploited and used for financial gain. But when Shawna described the islands and the beautiful fields of indigo and the flowers and being on the coast like that, right away I knew that that would be such an interesting and powerful landscape to explore one of our main characters' childhood, this idea of juxtaposing the beauty of the landscape with the violence and barbarity, quite frankly, of slavery. And so that was something right away that Shawna was imagining as part of the landscape. And as a writer who has always sort of prided herself in writing passages where you could see everything and feel everything, that's very visually rich. My mother is an artist. When she started speaking this way, I knew right away that we were going to be a great team together, but I didn't want to pressure her. Like, I didn't want to be like, okay, we're going to do it. But I felt this energy between us that afternoon. And so I said to Shawna, look, I think we have so much here to start writing a novel, but I also am very, conscious of the fact that you have a day job that is very, stressful, and that you have a lot of responsibility. And I don't want to embark on this project with you, and then we write a 300-page book, and then we don't sell it. So let's try and see if we can write 40 pages together and write a proposal and see if we can sell it basically on spec to a publisher. And that way we would also feel like we could have a sort of synchronicity of how we were going to create together. And so what we decided to do is that every Sunday night we would brainstorm.
So let me say one thing. Many people assume that I wrote all of the Black characters and Alyson wrote all of the white Jewish characters, and that is not at all how we did it. So before we even decided let's do 40 pages, we had to figure out this thing. How are we going to collaborate seamlessly?
Right. We wanted to create one seamless narrative voice, and that was something right on that afternoon we said. We didn't want you, as Shawna said, to be like, oh, now Shawna's writing and you're pulled out of the narrative, and because she writes maybe in a different way than my style would be. We wanted you to feel that you were being ushered into a story where you were walking in the footsteps of the characters. And we also love this sort of metaphor of blending our histories and our minds and our hearts together to create that voice. So every Sunday night, we would brainstorm 20 pages at a time of what was going to happen plot-wise. And I would take a first pass again, because I wanted to be respectful of my, full-time working friend, of taking a first pass in a very broad strokes, sort of sketching out what we discussed. I like to describe it almost as like a wire armature that had shape and form, but wasn't fully finished in any way. And I would tell Sean, the Google Docs up, and now it's your time to go in and to start polishing and adding.
And then I would go through and I would do a layer and then she would do a layer. And we're both kind of perfectionists. We're both like anxiety ridden perfectionists. Actually, and our mothers are exactly the same. They made us this way. But we wouldn't move on until we felt like those 20 pages were perfect. And so because of that, we were constantly like editing each other's works. And by the end, when we put in our final manuscript, it was pretty clean. Now, we collaborated on every single instance of all of the words that we read here. Where two heads was also better than one was when it came to research, because we were able to divide and conquer that. I spent a lot of time down in New Orleans. It was during the pandemic. My mother still lives there, so it was nice to be able to go home, and after she would Lysol me down, I would go and I would work with organizations like the Amistad Research Center, which has made it its mission to catalog the lives of not only extraordinary African Americans, but also everyday African Americans, the Historic New Orleans collection. And then also, I got an opportunity to go and visit Port Hudson. And Port Hudson plays a major role in our book. Raise your hand if you've ever seen that movie Glory with Denzel Washington, that one tier, right? It's a beautiful, beautiful movie. And it details the bravery of the soldiers in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment when they stormed Fort Wagner, and many of them were killed. And I guess I had grown up, even with parents that are very focused on making me proud of my lineage, thinking that those instances of bravery were isolated, that they weren't played out, like that was the pinnacle of African-American bravery in the Civil War. And then I stumbled upon Port Hudson, and I was ashamed when I found out about this, because I've grown up 90 minutes from this battlefield and had never known about it. So during the Civil War, the Mississippi Delta and New Orleans was a very important, it was a football, like people were very focused on grabbing it in order to control the force, and also to make sure that other countries didn't send aid to the Confederacy. So they finally decided at Port Hudson that they were going to let Black soldiers fight for their freedom, right? We're going to give you guns, you're going to go in there. However, there had not been the appropriate level of reconnaissance, and even though the Confederate soldiers were outgunned, outmanned, they held a higher ground. So they sent hundreds of Black soldiers in, and the Confederate soldiers shot down on them, and hundreds of them were massacred on that first day. And that's obviously a tragedy. But what was even more tragic is the Union officers, I think, having realized their mistake or their negligence, they wouldn't allow anyone to go in to collect their bodies. So their bodies laid there for weeks, decomposing. And they were led by a wonderful Lieutenant General, I was a captain actually at the time, Andre Kalu. And by the time that their bodies were recovered, he was only identifiable by a signet ring. And who did they send in to gather these decomposing bodies? They sent the rest of the Black troops that they had left. And there just was a sense for me when I went to spend the day at Port Hudson, when I say you could feel like the ghost and the sacrifice, you could feel it, but the sense of like, I think how we treat people in life is one thing, I think that says a lot about our society, but I'm a woman of faith. I think many of you might be, and I think how we treat people in death perhaps says something even more. And that became so heartbreaking to me. I called up Alyson and I said, will you, no, don't, Sonny. Sometimes they cry. Sonny's my nickname for her. I think like, I called her up and I said, hey, do you ever heard of this? And she said, no. And I said, well, then it has to go in the book. And that kind of became the way we thought about historical fact, because this was very well researched, but we didn't want anyone to feel like bludgeoned over the head with history. I mean, that's not how people like to learn. So it kind of became this thing where if we came across something in our research and we thought we should have known it, we're both well educated, we're a little embarrassed we didn't know it, then we wanted to put it in the book, but in a way that you would be rooting for these characters, you would feel like you were walking in their footsteps, and you might learn a little over the way. So
Absolutely.
do you want to go right? What do you think? I'm conscious of the time. I won't give that time for questions. I'm sorry you hear our internal monologue.
There is one other thing, because that will be in the slide presentation. I think what Shawna had just said was very much close in our hearts about wanting to be able to illuminate parts of history that's, oftentimes, most of the time, probably we don't get in the classroom. When I was up north doing the research for the book, I had gotten a book. Oh, sure. There's one mic that works better, so thank you for pointing that out. I didn't realize it. So what I was saying is that when Shawna was down south doing Port Hudson research for the book, and we both believed very much so that when we discovered these parts of history that we had not been taught or read about in the classroom, we wanted to share a way to incorporate them in the book, as Shawna said, without, banging over the head with the history. So when I was up north researching how Lily, the abolitionist, was experiencing the Civil War, I came across a chapter in a book published by the New York Historical Society that was called 50 Artifacts of the Civil War. That's in the collection of the New York Historical Society in Manhattan. And it was a Bible that had once been in the house with the Black Children's Orphanage on 42nd and 5th Avenue. It was this beautiful orphanage that had a nursery, school, a garden in the back with farm animals. And you can just imagine 5th Avenue with something as beautiful as that, with almost like a rural setting back in that time during the 1860s. But during the draft riots, a group of white men surrounded this orphanage and tried to burn it down with all 233 children inside, Black children inside. Luckily, a teacher was able to shepherd all the children out to safety. But because of the foresight of one young Black child who took the Bible that was on a podium outside their dining hall, that is the only artifact from that orphanage to this day. And so I called Shawna up and I said, did you ever hear about this? And she said no. And I said, we have to find a way to share this with our readers without it being, again, so bombastically written that you don't want to turn the next page. And that's how we just had this conversation about creating Lily's letters of her writing to Jacob down south, so that you could, when he was on the battlefield, you could hear in her voice how she was experiencing history in real time in New York. But it was really these conversations of trying to find a way to be sensitive to the reader's tolerance for violence that really happened, and we felt was really important to record because it is something of our history, but also, I don't want to say educating you, but so sharing the knowledge with you that you would still be able to turn the next page and learn from us.
Yeah. So before we open it up to questions, and we definitely want your question, Randy, are we good to go? We wanted to show you, I might have to get over here, I am sure. Some of the photos of things that inspired us or that we came across. Okay, yay. I just like this picture of me and Alyson. It's after my wedding in my mama's backyard. So yes. You can't tell she's not wearing shoes, so we're not so far apart. I'll also tell you another little funny story while this gets teed up. So one of the things about a Google Doc is that you can leave little notes for each other. So sometimes it could be very important, like, well, let's discuss the character development. And sometimes it's a little lighthearted. So Alyson has a way of describing most female characters as tall, like sunflowers. And as you can see, I'm a little shorter. And so one time I just wrote in the margins, I was like, can we get some curves? Like, can we go to the next one? Thank you. Oh no. Okay, no worries. Okay. So a couple of places in New Orleans, real life places that we use. St. Anthony of Padua. So we have our Black women in our novel. They are Catholic, like I am. They worship at St. Anthony of Padua, which was a real life church at the time. And it was unusual because you had white people, free Black people, and enslaved people. They all worshiped in the same church. They would use different pews, of course. And so I just wanted to highlight that because I thought it was just an interesting, it was like a little microcosm of how New Orleans was. People very mixed up, even though they might have different rights and certainly different statuses. Oh, can you go back? Yeah. And on the left-hand side, we have William at one point with Jacob William is sharing some of the rhythms, the African rhythms that he's learned in Congo Square. So Congo Square is a very interesting place in the 1800s because usually in America, people did not allow enslaved people from different plantations to gather. They didn't want people to be fomenting rebellion, passing along information. It was usually not allowed unless you could have people who were owners of those people, like watching them, making sure. But in Congo Square, enslaved people were allowed to gather freely. They had a half day off on Sunday, and it became almost like a trading post. So if you could grow a little bit of extra vegetables, if you had a trade, you would bring it there. And also they would drum, they would play music, until the point where the music became so good that you even started having like adventurous white people come out to like do a little trading, but also listening to the music. So I like to think of it as like the first jazz club. And Congo Square still exists today. Now that area is called Louis Armstrong Park. I will say it's only a stone's throw from where they also used to sell enslaved people. So it is full circle.
So this is actually the great uncle in my family who moved down to Mississippi. This is the family homestead that's still in existence. It's in a place called Satarsha, Mississippi. We use that particular town even in the book because we wanted to be as close to historical fact as possible. The house, interestingly enough, during the time of the Civil War was taken possession by General Grant during the Battle of Vicksburg, and it was temporarily used as a hospital. Sean and I were able to locate a newspaper article written in 1890 in the Yazoo County News about this house, and they described the garden in the back with seashell-lined paths and fruit trees and lots and lots of flowers. And we thought that it was so visually evocative. We wanted to make sure that in the novel we had at least one scene that took place in the house, and we decided to do a Passover scene. It's the only time you see in the novel the two brothers together. And we wanted to have a conversation, fictitiously between these two brothers as the Civil War was, really at its precipice of igniting. And because Passover is, this Jewish people's retelling of escaping their own bondage out of slavery, out of Egypt, we really wanted to, explore that holiday and this discussion period. So here, that's fun.
And the next one. Thank you. So our heroine Stella is named after my mother, Stella. That's her on the left. She's just as short as she appears to be there. But behind us, what you can see, all of those things that are rolled up, those are our family quilts. So when I talk about the quilts from my grandmother and my great-grandmother, and to give more context to this, in New Orleans, we had about 10 feet of water in Katrina. So all of these clothes had to be rescued, cleaned, restored. For us, they're like our family heirlooms. And I'm so glad that my mother recognized the historical value in them to us and that she saved them. So we're just holding some clothes. And on the left side, this is a square of a quilt that I have framed in my bathroom in New York City. And it's made from my grandmother's church dresses and my great-grandmother's field dresses. She worked cotton farm. And I like to just look at it in the morning before I get dressed and put on my makeup and my armor and go out in the world. Just remember the women from whence I came. So when I talk about that initial seed of an idea, I think these things I carry them with me.
It's incredible. Tell them how there's still seeds of the cotton.
Oh yeah, so she's seen our oldest quilt, which I'm not allowed to have. That's in my mother's house. It's so old that you can feel the cotton seeds still in the batting. Because it wasn't like ginned cotton, it was just cotton that they pulled and they stuffed.
Wow.
All right, so as I mentioned, Port Hudson, these are some photos from my trip to Port Hudson, and it is a national park. There are park rangers there who have a wealth of history, but they've also done a really good job of recreating so you could see the Black soldiers there, what they were wearing. That's all invaluable to Alyson and I as we were creating this book. And if you go to the next one. For those of you who read the book, you also know that William and Jacob have a little friend. His name is Teddy, and he is a drummer boy. And I brought up the idea of Teddy on that first writing day in Juneteenth. I said, I really want there to somewhere be a Black child, because I think this country doesn't think enough about who's entitled to a childhood and what kind of childhood people are entitled to have. So for us, it was really important to have Teddy in.
So this is our last slide in the presentation. It is from one of the Gullah Geechee Islands. Shawna and I, and also my daughter, who's 15 at the time, we decided to actually visit one of the Gullah Geechee Islands. So this is St. Helena's Island. And we were really blessed to be able to have a mother-daughter tour guide team who could trace their lineage all the way back to the time of slavery and share their Gullah history with us. And one of the things that they pointed out to us was the architecture on the island. There's something very distinct and unique to Gullah architecture. It's a building material called tabby. And to this day, the recipe of this building material has been lost. It came from Africa, but you can see how incredibly durable it is. That even so many centuries later, it's still standing. Even though hurricanes have swept through these islands for so many years, it's still standing. All we know is that two of the ingredients are oyster shells and lime. And if you walk up close to one of the walls, you can actually see the oyster shells pressed into the surface. It's really incredible. And this picture with the Spanish moss sort of draping it over the structure does give this very, eerie, haunting quality to it. So we wanted to share that with you. One of the other things that we were really lucky enough to do on the island was to visit a praise house that was on a former plantation. And this mother-daughter duo, when they brought us into this sacred space where African people were able to sing spirituals on Sunday, you could really feel, I don't say this lightly, as our mother-daughter team started to sing some of the spirituals handed down to them. We felt the ghost amongst us. It was very holy and it was very special. And we tried to bring that back to the passages in the book where you have William and his mother, and how music really became that sort of foundation for his challenge and his childhood. And hopefully you can now visualize the landscape of William's childhood that we tried to recreate in the novel.
So thank you for listening with such attention. That is our last slide. We are more than open to questions. We love questions, and out there in Zoom land, we love you too. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. This was so fascinating, really great. So I'm going to just get us started, and then I'm going to come to the audience and ask questions. So you guys learned so much about your own history. Was there anything that you learned through this process about the perspective of your own histories through learning about each other's history that changed?
Our own histories through learning about their history.
Right.
Look, I think that it's possible to really become focused on, understandably, your own people's trauma, right? So I've read a lot about the Civil War before, before Alyson even approached me with this project, right? Like I've read Shelby Foote Volume 1 and 2. Like I thought I knew about it, but I had never known that General Grant had expelled Jewish soldiers from the Union Army. And I went to a school that was originally founded as a Jewish orphanage in New Orleans. So it's not like I'm completely ignorant of Jewish history in the context of America. And I was a little, I guess, I don't want to say ashamed, because I think there's so many things that we're not taught. But I think it's really easy to look at any terrible thing in history and really focus on its impact on who you know, who looks like you. And it just made me take a step back. And that is not to compare the perspectives of any people through any period of trauma. I sometimes call it a trauma off, which I hate. Like everybody is like trying to like, people have been traumatized more than trauma. I don't like engage in that. But it does just make you think like, what else could you find out about something that's had a great impact on you, but that might have also had a great impact on you?
Yeah, I mean, I learned so much about Shawna's history while writing this book. And so many parallels I felt toward, with the Jewish experience. And there was one afternoon, I remember I was reading Tyler Miles' All That She Carried. Some of you might have read it. It won the National Book Award for nonfiction last year. And there was a passage describing a young mother who was basically having to pack a flour sack with certain things because her daughter was in moments going to be sold. And so in this flour sack, she put a cutting of her hair, a clean dress, 3 pecans, and all of her love, the way that the passage was written. And as I read it, I had almost like this deja vu that this could have been a passage in a Holocaust, if someone writing about having experienced the Holocaust, a mother maybe losing her child and packing something away. And I called Shawna and I said, to me, this parallel is so profound. It was new to me. I've never drawn that parallel before. And Shawna said, of course there's a parallel. And it was that moment where I think I just realized, again, what Shawna said, it's so often we're looking at our own people's experience, and that this has made me much more, open my eyes to the parallels in other communities.
Great, thank you. Are there questions from the audience that you want to start? Okay, go ahead.
I was so, intrigued with the map. That was so, okay, that's so ingenious. So I want to know, Shawna, you came up with that idea just from your background in sewing?
Yes, ma'am, my brain just works like.
In seconds, like.
Yeah, no, it's the way my brain works. Now I will say, we were not able to find any, because I don't think that I'm the only person that ever lived. It was like, we looked into it, we're like, someone had to have actually done this. We were not able to find any instance of, in the Civil War, like a map having been sewn. But of course, there are historical examples of people using ingenious ways to lead people to freedom out of slavery, right? So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the quilts that would be placed on different ways on clotheslines in order to point people toward safe houses on the Underground Railroad. There are some historians that have called into question whether that really happened, but I tend to believe the oral history more because there's archival deficiency in the African-American community. When you take away people's literacy, you have to rely more on the word of mouth. Certainly hair braiding, so the direction and patterns of hair braiding was used in order to help people escape to freedom, and also drumming, like different drumming, different chants, like when things were safe, when people were going to be on the lookout. So there were many different context clues and signals used in order to point people to freedom, but we weren't able to find this exact thing. We did find, Alyson found, she's a fabulous researcher, I think she's a white spy during the Civil War, would embroider little things on her petticoat, but we didn't find any like maps to freedom.
Could I just ask, why didn't you include any of those gorgeous photographs in the book?
Well, I can answer that for you. So in publishing, they don't ever pay for photographs to be printed in a novel. It's very, very costly to produce. So it comes down to money.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? Okay, we should have left that.
Yeah, sure. But how do you ask something they don't hear?
Yes, they can.
Go ahead,
It's fine, go on.
go ahead, ask the question.
Oh, okay. That doesn't come for sound strange, but of course, there's another book about collaboration that has some connection. If yours, I guess you know what I'm talking about, personal librarian. Yeah, and you were probably writing the very.
Well, that's not a Civil War. I mean, that's about.
No, certainly a very different story. I just wondered if you ever had any contact with.
I
usually I do 2 authors, which I
Yeah.
had not really heard about.
So I know Marie Bennett, she's such a talented author. And so when that came out, of course, I was so thrilled. We had already started working on our project by that time. But I think you're going to be seeing more and more of these collaborations begin. I think also, not just because I think the audience enjoys reading them, but I think when you're a creative and curious person and someone who's writing, you love learning. And so having someone who you're learning from at the same time that you're creating something just makes it a really special and unique experience.
Yeah, I think the other one was Nat Honey. That was a.
Yeah, I read that, yeah.
So follow-up question to that. Now that you're writing on your own, are you finding it more challenging? Oh my God, yes.
So I've been writing for 25 years.
As I said, it takes me typically 2.5 years to write a book. We wrote this book in 9 months. I mean, it was crazy. Like when we got the deadline from the publisher, I think they gave us 11 months, but then she was getting married and she said she didn't want to be on her honeymoon writing. So we had to finish it. We sold it in December. We had to finish it by May. I'm terrible at math, but that was basically the deadline. So she lit the fire under my pants writing.
I'm very task oriented.
Her project. You like that?
So now I'm writing, another standalone, and it's taken me 7 weeks to get to 50 pages. And I sometimes am writing, I'm like, oh, Shawna's here.
At least 150.
Yeah, exactly. There would be many times, when I would be taking the first pass, I would get to something that we hadn't discussed on a Sunday night, and I needed to know if the character was going to go here or there. And typically, I would think about something like that. I did a shower. If I did that, then that would happen, and I would ruminate over it. But this way, I had like her on speed dial. Like, we have 2 choices. Does she go here? So I would be like, I have 30 seconds. She goes there. I'm like, okay. So it was really funny.
Yeah, that's so funny. Any other questions in the audience?
Can you see if there's any online?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, are there any online? Where would I see them?
Just.
Are there any questions online if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question or put it in the chat?
I'll hide that in, so while we're waiting.
Okay,
Okay.
any questions? Oh, you have one person on this here.
First of all, when you wrote your first 40 pages, how was it received? I was wondering how much. The other thing is, Shawna, I was just wondering, with your family history when you're researching it, were any of your ancestors enslaved?
So undoubtedly, but we haven't traced it all the way back, right? So through the genealogical work we've done, I think we've gotten a little bit more than 100 years back. But when you take away a people's ability to put records down and you rip them apart from their families, it's very, very hard to figure it out. So that's to say, yes, I always have assumed that we were, particularly considering the area of the country where my family is from,
But when your mother was born, she was in a cotton farm.
Yeah, my mom.
So they were free at that point. It was like.
Oh, my mom was born in 1938.
It wasn't land that it received like in compensation or,
No, that 40 acres and a mule myth, like we were actually working on a reconstruction novel. I think people think that really happened and it really didn't. A lot of that land that was given out was actually taken away. So no, that was land that they farmed. Sharecropping it's essentially a glorified form of enslavement. You farm a piece of property for someone that owns it, and at the end of the year, you're lucky if you don't owe back more than what you ever received. It's like living in a company town, like if you were a coal miner. So yes, I'm undoubtedly sure, but I can't give you the name of the person. And then
how was it received after the first 40 pages?
So our agent got the first 40 pages and she was super excited about the book, really, really passionate about it. And we were able to find a publisher right away. So it was really well received. And we're lucky enough that we got an editor who, took it on with 40 pages and hopefully delivered something that you're all enjoying. And we do hope to sort of continue the story into Reconstruction and into the Harlem Renaissance with our characters and their progeny and music always emerging and one of the, offspring. So we have big plans. So spread the word. To see book sales. So spread the word. And we have ideas.
yeah.
Are there any questions online?
No.
Okay, you had a question back here.
You have to repeat the question because I'm thinking.
Okay.
This is very fascinating. I suspect that there are a lot of grandparents in the room, so is your novel, something that you feel is appropriate for teenagers?
Yes, so the question for those in Zoom land was, is the novel appropriate for teenagers? I think absolutely. One of the things that we ensured was that, so not to put too fine a point on it, but Stella is enslaved and she is kept for personal purposes of a Confederate soldier, but you never seen those themes of that type of violence, because we didn't want to express that, like we wanted to be more focused on some of the optimism of the time, maybe some of the aspirations and the hope of Black people. Now, that's not to say that there's not violence in here, but I have 3 nieces, the twins are 14 and the eldest is 16, and they've read the novel. And of course, it raises questions, you know, because a lot of schools are not really focusing on certain aspects of history. So it might raise questions and topics that they haven't dealt with before. But there's nothing in here that I think would be inappropriate for a teenager. And there are also book club questions in the back to help younger people process through.
So they're very much so appropriate for a teenager.
Do we have time for one more question or, okay, any other questions?
The last question.
Any last question?
Okay.
All right, well, thank you so much. This was amazing. And we I would like to be saying is quickly purchase the book and you can get just for you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.